So welcome to today's deep dive. We are really glad you're joining us. Today we are going to be looking at a really dense Reuters report from Sunday, April 26th.
Right. It is an incredibly heavy dispatch.
There-
Very dense.
It really is. And the focus here is a highly strained ceasefire in Lebanon. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to put this single news report under a microscope to understand the anatomy of a failing ceasefire.
Which is deeply necessary, because what's fascinating here is how much contradiction is packed into just a few paragraphs.
Exactly. We're going to look at the exact timeline, the shift in geography, the really stark numbers, and the specific rhetoric used by both Israel and Hezbollah.
And we are doing this strictly by the book.
Right. And I want to emphasize that for you listening right now.
Yeah.
Because this involves the highly charged Israel-Hezbollah conflict, we are acting purely as an impartial mirror to the source material today.
We aren't taking sides here.
No, not at all. We are just acting as your analytical guides to help you really understand the information and the viewpoints exactly as they are presented in this specific Reuters dispatch.
Right. We are mapping out the structure of what is happening based entirely on the data they provided.
So before we can even begin to understand why bombs are still dropping, we need to trace the chronological breadcrumbs that the source gives us just to see how we arrived at this past Sunday.
The timeline is everything in a dispatch like this.
It really is. So the text notes that the recent war between Hezbollah and Israel began on March 2nd. But it doesn't just give us that date in a vacuum, right?
No, it crucially contextualizes it.
Yeah, it says this start date was just days after the U.S. and Israel launched strikes against Iran.
Right. And that chronological link is vital. The Reuters report is explicitly establishing a chain of regional causality here.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, it's basically saying the war in Lebanon didn't just ignite spontaneously. It's presented in the text as a rapid, downstream consequence of broader macro-level regional friction.
Friction involving Iran.
Exactly. It sets the stage for understanding that the local conflict between Israel and Hezbollah is tethered to a much larger geopolitical engine.
Right, it's connected. And then the timeline just accelerates remarkably fast from there. I mean, we go from the outbreak of war on March 2nd to a U.S.-mediated ceasefire starting on April 16th.
Which is incredibly fast.
Right. That's just a little over 6 weeks of active conflict before a major diplomatic intervention takes hold.
A very compressed window, for sure.
And the text explicitly notes this ceasefire was formally extended to mid-May.
It does.
But then, despite this formal extension, on Sunday, April 26th, deadly strikes occurred. The report details 14 killed in Lebanon and 1 Israeli soldier killed.
Yeah, the paradox highlighted in the text is really striking.
I mean, how can a ceasefire be formally, quote, extended to mid-May while simultaneous airstrikes and casualties are happening? It's like calling a timeout in a football game, but the referees just stand there and watch as the players continue to tackle each other on the sidelines.
That is actually a really great way to visualize it. What you're describing and what the report is detailing is the concept of an asymmetric ceasefire.
An asymmetric ceasefire.
Right. It's a situation where the paper agreement and the ground reality are operating on two completely different frequencies.
So they aren't synced up at all.
Not at all. The diplomatic agreement, the timeout in your football analogy, it exists to maybe satisfy international mediators or prevent a wider regional war.
But the tackling continues.
Exactly. The text even notes that the ceasefire brought a, quote, significant reduction in hostilities.
Right, a reduction, not an end.
Yes, reduction is the key word. It means we aren't seeing massive ground invasions, but both sides are still actively firing and trading blame over breaches. The kinetic engagement has just been refined, not stopped.
Wow. Okay, so if the timeline is this fractured, it makes sense that the physical borders are breaking down too.
The geography always reflects the reality on the ground.
Right. Because the breakdown of this timeline isn't just happening on paper, it's physically shifting the geography of the conflict. Which brings us to the specific locations mentioned in Sunday's warnings.
The Reuters dispatch provides incredibly specific geographical data here.
It does. The core information from the report states that the Israeli military warned residents to leave 7 towns. But the detail that really stands out is where these towns are located.
Right, their location is highly significant.
The text says these towns are specifically located beyond the, quote, buffer zone that Israel occupied before the ceasefire.
Let's really look at that term for a second. Buffer zone.
Yeah. What does that imply in this specific context?
Well, a buffer zone is a pre-existing perimeter. The text notes Israel occupied this zone before the April 16th ceasefire. It's meant to be a static, secure space separating two opposing forces.
But now they are ordering evacuations beyond it. Geographically, the report says these towns are north of the Litani River and north of the current Israeli-occupied zone in southern Lebanon.
Which is a massive topographical detail. The Litani River is a formidable natural boundary.
So crossing it is a big deal.
It's a huge deal. If residents are being told to leave towns beyond the existing buffer zone and north of the Litani, it suggests an expansion of military operations beyond previously established lines.
Even though the ceasefire is technically in effect.
Exactly. Despite the paper agreement, the physical footprint of the conflict is growing. The tactical objectives appear to be evolving.
And the way they're moving these residents is really specific, too. The text specifically says residents were told to move, quote, north and west.
Right, directional movement.
Yeah. So for the listener trying to visualize this, what does it mean when a military force dictates specific directional movements to a civilian population like that?
It's a profound indicator of battle space management.
Battle space management.
Yeah. When you instruct a civilian population to move specifically north and west, you aren't just telling them to flee danger. You are actively channeling non-combatants into a defined corridor.
So you are controlling their flow.
Precisely. You are keeping them out of your anticipated avenues of approach. Moving them west toward the coast and further north clears the board.
It empties the towns entirely.
Right. And from a purely tactical standpoint, an empty town is a fundamentally different operational environment than a populated one.
Because you don't have to worry about civilians in the crossfire.
Exactly. It reduces the variables for the advancing military and essentially creates a defined zone where anyone remaining is presumably classified differently.
Wow. Okay, so this expansion of the combat zone, this shifting geography, it is directly tied to how each side justifies their actions to the public and the world.
The rhetoric has to match the ground strategy.
Right, and this is vividly captured in the official statements from Sunday. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have these dueling narratives that are just fundamentally incompatible.
The ideological architecture of the conflict is completely exposed in this dispatch.
Let's start with Israel's stance. The report states they claim Hezbollah is violating the ceasefire, but then it gives this very direct quote from Prime Minister Netanyahu.
A very carefully worded quote.
Yeah, Netanyahu states, quote, "From our perspective, what obliges us is the security of Israel, the security of our soldiers, the security of our communities."
He's rooting his actions in the foundational duty of a sovereign state.
Right, border and citizen security.
Yeah.
But then he goes on to claim that Israel acts according to, quote, "rules we agreed upon with the United States and also, by the way, with Lebanon."
And that second half is the crucial rhetorical maneuver.
He is explicitly invoking international agreements to justify continued military action.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Netanyahu is leaning heavily on the concept of agreed-upon rules and international frameworks. He isn't claiming the ceasefire is dead.
He's claiming Israel is enforcing it.
Precisely. He is utilizing the architecture of U.S. and Lebanese diplomacy to provide a structural, legitimate justification for what his military is doing.
Okay, but then you look at Hezbollah's stance in the exact same report, and it is a complete 180-degree rejection of that entire framework.
It's a structural rejection, yes.
The report says Hezbollah stated they will not cease attacks as long as Israel continues, quote, ceasefire violations.
So there's the baseline mirror image blame game. Both say the other started it.
Right. But then they state they will not wait for diplomacy that has, quote, proven ineffective.
That phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, it really is. And they take it even further. They state they will not rely on Lebanese authorities that had, quote, failed to protect the country.
Which is an incredible statement for a non-state actor to make about its own domestic government.
It's basically actively undermining their own government's authority on an international stage.
Entirely. By saying the Lebanese state failed to protect the country, Hezbollah is not just defying Israel, but they are actively dismissing the authority of Beirut.
So Netanyahu is citing rules agreed upon with Lebanon, and Hezbollah is saying Lebanon has no power to agree to anything.
Exactly. Hezbollah is positioning itself as the sole legitimate defender of the territory, entirely bypassing the formal government structures.
So diplomacy is entirely stalled when one side views the diplomatic channels themselves as illegitimate.
Right. You have Netanyahu using the rule book of international relations, and Hezbollah explicitly stating the rule book is void and the mediators are ineffective.
And behind all these contrasting political statements, behind this diplomatic deadlock, there is a staggering human cost.
The human toll is where the abstraction of policy becomes visceral reality.
And the Reuters report provides a very specific, yet highly complex set of numbers for us to digest. Let's look at the localized snapshot first.
The Sunday toll.
Yeah. The core information for Sunday shows 14 killed and 37 wounded in Lebanon by Israeli strikes.
That's in a single 24-hour period.
Right, under an active ceasefire. And the report specifically notes this included 2 children and 2 women.
Which highlights the civilian impact immediately.
Then on the Israeli side, Sunday saw 1 Israeli soldier killed and 6 wounded by Hezbollah.
So even in a quote-unquote reduced hostility environment, the daily kinetic friction is highly lethal.
It is. But then the report zooms out and gives us the numbers since March 2nd. And this is where the fog of war is explicitly mentioned in the text.
The macro numbers are incredibly dense.
For Lebanon, the health ministry reports over 2,500 killed since March 2nd.
2,500 people.
Yes. And the toll specifically includes 277 women, 177 children, and 100 medics.
Those specific demographics are crucial.
They are. But the Reuters report adds a massive caveat. It states that the Lebanese health ministry does not distinguish between militants and civilians in its total count.
This is the literal definition of the fog of war.
Yeah, and it notes Hezbollah has buried dozens of fighters in group funerals, but hasn't announced a total toll. So I want you, the listener, to deeply consider the implications of this. If we are trying to understand the civilian impact, how do we process a number like 2,500 when it explicitly lacks that crucial categorization between combatant and non-combatant?
It is an incredibly difficult analytical challenge. The data itself becomes a battleground in asymmetric warfare.
Because it obscures the reality on the ground.
Exactly. By grouping combatants and non-combatants together, the total impact is maximized for public consumption, but the analytical clarity is deliberately obscured.
But the source does provide hard numbers for specific groups, right?
Yes, and that is what we have to anchor to. While the 2,500 total is opaque, the report gives us a definitive floor of non-combatants.
The 277 women, the 177 children, and the 100 medics.
Right, that's 554 individuals who, under international norms, are distinctly non-combatants.
I really want to focus on that detail about the 100 medics. Because losing 100 medical professionals, that's not just a casualty statistic.
No, it represents a systemic collapse.
Right, it's the erasure of thousands of hours of specialized training.
It deeply degrades the resilience of the entire population. When medics are dying at that rate, it drastically reduces the survivability rate for everyone else, civilians and combatants alike.
And then, when we look at the numbers for Israel since March 2nd, the contrast is just jarring. The report states 2 civilians killed in Israel and 16 Israeli soldiers died in Lebanon.
The disparity tells a profound story about the nature of this specific conflict.
You have 2,500 total dead in Lebanon, compared to 18 total dead for Israel.
And notice how the Israeli data explicitly separates civilian from military casualties.
Right. 2 civilians, 16 soldiers.
It reflects a conventional state apparatus managing information. And the fact that 16 of those 18 casualties were soldiers inside Lebanon shows that the physical ground friction is almost entirely contained within Lebanese territory.
Which brings us to the actual tactics on the ground. To understand how these casualties are occurring right now, we need to look at the specific military tactics reported on Sunday.
Because they paint a picture of highly targeted yet chaotic engagements.
Exactly. The report details that Israel struck Hezbollah fighters, rocket launchers, and a weapons depot.
So we are seeing a dual approach. They are targeting personnel, the fighters, but they're also targeting infrastructure.
The launchers and depots.
Right. It's a calculated effort to dismantle the logistical supply chain. This isn't indiscriminate firing. These are highly specific logistical strikes.
And Israel also intercepted 3 drones before they crossed into Israeli territory. The text notes this triggered sirens in northern Israel.
Drones are a fascinating tactical element here.
Even when they're intercepted, they still have an impact.
Oh, absolutely. Even intercepted, they trigger sirens, which disrupts daily life and maintains constant psychological pressure on the civilian population. The disruption is the objective.
But Hezbollah's tactics on Sunday were entirely different.
Oh.
The report states Hezbollah attacked Israeli troops inside Lebanon, and this is the part that really stands out. They specifically attacked the rescue force that came to evacuate them.
Yes, the secondary strike.
The report says this attack on the rescue force resulted in the 1 dead and 6 wounded Israeli soldiers. In the mechanics of warfare, what does it mean when medical or evacuation units become the primary targets of an engagement?
It's the deployment of what's often called a double-tap logic. It is a brutal, deeply unforgiving tactical calculation.
Because they're using the wounded as bait.
Basically, yes. You exploit the fundamental human instinct to save wounded comrades. The initial strike draws in the highly specialized rescue teams, and then you launch the secondary strike.
Wow. It's designed to maximize lethality among specialized personnel.
It is the brutal reality of this specific conflict zone. And if we tie this back to Netanyahu's statement earlier about prioritizing the, quote, security of our soldiers,
Right.
this specific tactical threat, the targeting of rescue forces, is exactly the type of scenario he is referencing to justify continued vigorous military action.
It strips away any illusion of conventional norms.
Completely.
So to summarize what we've unpacked today, we started with a piece of paper, essentially. A U.S.-mediated ceasefire, formally extended to mid-May.
A diplomatic framework.
Right.
Right.
But we found that on the ground, the reality reported by Reuters is a widening geographical buffer zone pushing people north and west.
And deeply entrenched, incompatible political rhetoric.
Exactly. Deadly tactical strikes involving drones, depots, and rescue forces. And thousands of casualties obscured by the fog of war.
The data reveals the true state of the conflict.
So what does this all mean? It means the word ceasefire in this context does not mean an absence of violence.
No, it simply means a different, highly managed phase of it.
A holding pattern for further kinetic action.
Yes.
Well, I want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on this dispatch but steps just outside our previous discussion.
It's a critical question to consider given the breakdown we just analyzed.
The text notes this ceasefire was, quote, U.S.-mediated, and Netanyahu claims to be following rules agreed upon with the United States.
The architecture of global diplomacy.
Right. But Hezbollah explicitly states they will not wait for diplomacy that has proven ineffective. So as you look at conflicts around the globe, consider this. What happens to the power of global mediation, like a U.S. brokered agreement, when the armed group on the ground fundamentally rejects the very concept of a diplomatic solution?
It completely destabilizes the established order.
How do you enforce a treaty when one side doesn't believe in the pen that signed it?
That is the defining question of modern conflict.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really appreciate you taking the time to explore this with us. We will catch you next time.